the way this is going to work, yes, I have another PowerPoint, so we will do a quick PowerPoint presentation to at least frame some of the key things that we're developing and thinking about and have been talking about primarily within the Community Housing Committee. We'll talk about that. And then we will go to the panel discussion, which will be a moderated discussion. We have 5 really interesting and varied backgrounds here that represent a lot of experience in different types of housing, all in the North Bay. So I think there's a lot of relevance and knowledge of what's happening here, not just from out somewhere else. This is very relevant and grounded to here. And that conversation is going to be built around a lot of the themes and questions, primarily that the Community Housing Committee has been asking, as we have been in the process of developing this thing we call the Housing Action Plan, which is a tool to begin implementing many of the things that the community has expressed they would like to see through the various workshops that we've had. So the Housing Action Plan, I'll talk in a minute about what that is, but it's a very important document that summarizes both our aspirations, but also the practical tools and actions that we're going to be taking to achieve a specific set of targets. And so this is a bit of a reality check, if you will. These are the people that build, finance, help facilitate the development of housing. In our previous work, we've talked about what we would like to have as a community. Tonight is when we get to do a quick check on do we have the right, are we headed in the right direction with the tools? And if this is what we've said we want to achieve, are we creating the right techniques, incentives, processes to achieve those things? The other thing that I'm going to say, and I say this every time because I think it can never be said enough, this is an extremely complicated subject. I know there's a lot of frustration. People that came to the last meeting as we didn't have enough time, the game board was too difficult, why were we using M&Ms? It's the way that we're trying to get people to understand how complicated this is. If this was easily fixed, we would not have the problem, not just in Healdsburg, we would not have the problem that we have in California. So this is very, very complicated. Secondly, there is no single solution. There's, the days of you just do this and it's all going to change overnight is not going to happen. So what we're working with in the Housing Action Plan and what I think you'll hear in the stories tonight are how different pieces of the puzzle, what some people call not a silver bullet, but 1,000 silver BBs. It's ways to kind of get together all the things that make an impact. The third thing that I'm going to say is we are pioneering something here in Healdsburg. There's a lot of communities that are doing different things, and I don't want you to underestimate how hard the community, the leadership, and the people that have spent a lot of time, a lot of citizens that are both sit on the Community Housing Committee and people that come faithfully to all the meetings, how hard people are working to try and find a solution that works for Healdsburg. Not just a universal solution that somebody else did, it's a solution that is appropriate to the character and the kind of place that we have here in Healdsburg and the kind of place that we want to maintain. The last thing that I'm going to say as we go into this is we are probably going to make some mistakes. And I think it's really important that people be willing to try some things differently as we pioneer and as we try to find a solution, and not to make the perfect the enemy of the good. I see this all over the country where I work. People just get totally paralyzed because they're so focused on finding absolutely every detail, finding every answer, getting the perfect solution when nobody knows what the perfect solution is. So we have to be willing to move forward, and we have to be willing to try some things. Big part of the panel tonight is to try and hear from the experts and the people who are in this business to try and guide us on what are the likely outcomes for the things that we're exploring and how can we get to the good on our way ultimately maybe to the perfect, but we're not going to get there the first time. So I want to encourage everybody to kind of come willingly, and I think collectively there's been a lot of good things that have come from the community, but it's important that we be willing to try some things differently, because I think maybe the only thing that we all know right now is what we have right now is not working. And it depends on what your measurement is, but I think we can safely say what we have is not working in full. So with that, a couple of quick framing slides. Why are we here? Again, it's a long process that we've been through, a lot of public input. And you as the community, people that are here, the people that have participated in surveys, people who have done the little polling, our games have said a couple of things. We need more housing that is affordable to a range of incomes. and there's a little bit of semantics in there. There is affordable housing, which is defined by the state and has very specific definitions and regulations, and then there is just housing that is affordable to members of the community, and we're trying to cover both of those. State-defined affordable housing and housing that is affordable to a group that we have called middle income. The second thing that people have said, and I feel like this is being lost sometimes in the discussion and the total focus on affordable housing, is people have said almost as much, we need more diversity in our housing. We have a lot of single-family housing in Healdsburg. We have not built rental apartments probably since the mid-90s. People love the images and the ideas of cottage courts, but we haven't built any of that. People have been talking a lot about smaller housing, because people's needs are changing. We don't have much of that. So not only do we need housing that is more affordable to a range of incomes, people also want to see ways that we can create more diversity of housing. You've also said that while we try and accommodate this housing, that we use growth, we just don't like pull off the lever and have growth run rampant, that we manage growth intelligently, which we have not necessarily done. We have controlled growth very well, but we haven't necessarily managed growth, and there's a big difference. One just puts a limit on how much growth. Managing growth says these are the kind of things we want, and you use the market and you use the tools you have to create the outcomes that you want. The outcomes that we talked about up above. The other thing is we want to ensure that new development fits into the community. It fits the blocks, the scale, the kind of pedestrian-friendly environment that we have, that we do that properly. So these are things that we've heard, kind of the big themes that we've heard time and again from the public meetings that we've had. So what are we doing to try and address those? And I'd say there's four things. First of all, we're updating the GMO. We're not removing the GMO, but we're updating the GMO to remove the barriers that really to more diverse housing types. And we just had a little bit of a pre-panel with the panel. We'll talk about this, but when there are only so many allocations available each year, it's harder to get the kinds of products that are either smaller or rental or the kinds of things we talked about, cottage courts, just because there aren't enough allocations out there. The second thing is we're rethinking the allocations as a tool to generate more housing units that are affordable to working families by being very clear. Right now, the allocations are what I would say blind. It doesn't matter whether you build a 500 square foot house that is affordable to a middle income family or a 5,000 square foot second home. It's each one allocation. We're trying to figure out how do we take those allocations and tell our development crew here, we want a big part of those allocations set aside for certain housing that is affordable, certain housing that is smaller. The third thing is we're crafting the first ever housing action plan to define specific actions and measurable targets that reflect what the community has said you would like. And then the last one is seeking new tools and funding to achieve the targets. So it leads to a very quick discussion about the GMO and what is being proposed. I know many of you have probably read some, there's a lot of discourse in the community. You may have been part of the telephone survey that was done, but here is what is being proposed, kind of in a nutshell. First of all, we're limiting the rate of growth to 1% per year based on the existing housing stock. So 1% per year, which is a number that everybody in the collective conversations we've had seem to be pretty comfortable with. What that translates to is instead of 30 housing allocations per year, it immediately takes us up to 45 allocations, which is 1% of 4,500 units, which is what we have in the community. Then the big difference is instead of having 45 each year, we aggregate all of those at the beginning to have 270 allocations available on day one. So if we want rental apartments, if we want projects that have the economies of scale, we can make those available to a developer coming in early on in bigger groups. Wouldn't get them all used up. Building in the current scheme, building anything more than 30 units is almost impossible because you can't get the allocations. Actually, building any more than 15 may be impossible. So the idea is to create more at the beginning. We know at the beginning of in this case, a 6-year cycle, how many allocations we have and where they would go. And then the last thing is take a percentage of those allocations to meet the stated needs of the community. The things that we've talked about are middle income housing and apartments. So very quickly, what's the difference between the old and the new? Under the old process, it is approved by and was approved by a ballot measure. It has no adaptability. It is fixed in perpetuity for what it is, 30 units per year, how they're applied, et cetera, et cetera. The allocation is 30 per year. It's a 3-year cycle for a total of 90. And it does not really address community priorities because it is blind to unit size or unit type. What we're proposing is still a public ballot measure. But there is a review process every year to see if it's working, and we can make those adjustments, knowing we're not going to get it perfect the first time. It raises it to 45 per year in this cycle, 1%, which times 6 years gives us 270 units, and it creates incentives through dedicated percentage of those 270 allocations to drive the market towards the kind of products we want. So that's a bit of it in a nutshell. We'll hear more about that or get into that a little bit more as we talk tonight. But I wanted to go from the GMO, which is it's the big thing, it's the elephant in the room, if you will, that everybody's talking about. But it is one tool in a larger discussion we're having about what do we want to be as a community. And back almost 6 months ago, with the Housing Committee and working with the community itself, we've had a number of conversations, and we picked 2022 because that is the end of the housing cycle that the GMO would be tied to. And we said, where do we want to be? Well, how would you describe Healdsburg walking down the street by 2022? And we said it's a diverse, thriving community evidenced by a wide diversity of housing. There's that word diversity again. And that individuals at different life stages, meaning all ages, economic levels, all incomes, can participate in active, welcoming neighborhoods that really make up the larger community. So it's not only about the housing themselves, but how they fit into the community. So that forms the foundation. That vision statement forms the foundation for all of the subsequent conversations, targets, objectives that we will get into about housing. We always come back to this as kind of our touchstone. So in order to get there, we said, what do we need to accomplish? And the first one was increase the number of deed-restricted affordable housing units. We have about 450 affordable housing units now, which is about 8% of the total housing stock. Through the various workshops, we've talked about trying to get that up, and I'll talk about what number. We've also talked about creating a new component of what we're calling middle-income housing, people that make too much to qualify for affordable housing, but not enough to qualify for market-rate housing, a new band of housing that's available for that. We want to encourage the private development of secondary dwelling units. This was, if I can give a quick shout out to a couple people, there are a number of people, as I said, who have steadfastly come to our meetings. This was really not in our list in the early days. And there are a number of people who continued to say, why aren't we looking at secondary dwelling units? This is being used across the state as a very effective tool for solving some of the rental and affordability issues. Fourth objective, increase the number of creative density housing options. And we use that term instead of saying just apartments or just cottage courts, thinking differently about housing gets put on the land, so we're calling creative density, but making more efficient use of land. And assuring well-designed housing in all new development, build affordable housing closer to existing or planned services, and reduce the impact of vacant homes on neighborhoods. So those are our big objectives. I think the other piece of that conversation was, and it's great to have those objectives, they're kind of mom and apple pie in some ways, they're a little more specific than some policy things, but we wanted to put a very clear target on the table. And the reason you put targets, I love the mantra that what gets measured gets done, and I think this is a very good example of both managing expectations and setting expectations. So through the process of the community workshops, we said we would like to see 200 new deed-restricted affordable housing units by 2022, which would in fact raise the percentage of affordable housing units in the community to about 12.5%. We would like to see 135 middle-income housing units by 2022, and if you include that in the group above, that takes us almost up to 15%, which is a pretty admirable goal and would put us in the top of the North Bay area. We want to see 125 secondary dwelling units built by 2022 by the private sector, so this means individuals building secondary dwelling units, which would add about 50% more secondary dwelling units that we currently have. And then the last one is 25% of all new applications for development reflect some kind of work on creative density. So not just single-family detached homes, but being something else. So those are the goals that we're putting out there. Part of the thing tonight is to discuss about, are those realistic? And so one of my other favorite quotes is, there's a fine line between vision and hallucination. And the panel tonight, this is kind of their intro. They're going to help us see how much of this is a stretch goal that we can all get behind and add energy to and look for creative ways to get to the end game. And at what point are we missing some key details that really makes it just a fantasy and we're not going to be very pleased with where we are in 2022. So, the panelists, how many people here watch soap operas? I know this is too smart a group to admit it in public, but So, you know, on the soap when they say today the part of so-and-so is going to be played by such and such. So tonight our panel, we've got a really great group. We had a pre-panel discussion with the committee. Each of them very experienced in their own right, cover a range of things related to housing. But, and you have the bio, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing them. But on the far left is Elizabeth Shepard. She really works in the financial environment, providing debt and equity capital to development, especially things in the North Bay, and typically multifamily and land development. So really understands where the money comes from. And really important, a lot of people may think you just go to the bank and get a loan. It's not that simple, especially when we're dealing in these kind of non-traditional markets like Healdsburg. Bob Comstock, to her right, is the home builder and developer as well, works all through California, but it lives up here and is developing the Sorrento Square project right up there on Healdsburg Avenue, so has some very current and very active information on what are the idiosyncrasies of the Healdsburg market. To his right is Hugh Fertel, who is has a very experienced resume as well, but has done a lot of multifamily development of all kinds, market rate, luxury, single family, and even affordable, and based in Santa Rosa. And then to his, to his right is Steve Sheldon, who represents, Steve is did you say the chair or the president of USGBC Northern California? Chair, yeah. So I know there's a lot of people that are interested in green and sustainability. Steve, represents that in his work as well as what he does daily, and he's been doing some really interesting kind of small-scale infill and mixed-use projects throughout the North Bay, based in Sebastopol. And then to his right is Chuck Cornell, who is the executive director and CFO of Burbank Housing, which many of you know you have about 2,500 affordable housing units in your portfolio. And Chuck was here for our workshop in. When was that? January? February. When we did the M&Ms. And so it was great to have him come back, and he has the benefit of all that conversation that went on with that. So I am going to stop talking here, and we are going to move to a panel format where we, first of all, I'm going to start by asking each of you to just take a very brief moment to talk about a project that maybe you're working on that will provide the audience at least with some insights both to the kinds of things that you do, but more importantly, some of the challenges that you're seeing. And Chuck, why don't you start us off?
Great, I'll do that. Well, first, I just want to clarify that Burbank Housing, when we talk about affordable housing, we're a affordable housing developer and property manager based in Sonoma County. We build both rental and sweat equity housing, so both home ownership and rental. All the way from Sea Ranch down to Sonoma, and we have 178 units or so in Healdsburg itself, and about 5 projects. We are currently, and have been for the last well over 10 years, working on a project down in Santa Rosa, southwest Santa Rosa, to build a 79-unit rental complex. And I'll point this out because you notice I mentioned it's taken 10 or 12 years to build. You know, the problems of the Great Recession are obviously upon us and still with us in the affordable housing business because of the lack of funding. With the Great Recession, there was the end of redevelopment. There was a dramatic drop-off in funding for affordable housing, and therefore our project has been really on ice for many years. It was ready to go, 6 or 8 years ago, but it's been sitting, waiting. We hope to go into construction, plan on going into construction this fall. And we'll get that underway and get those homes built. But the combined high cost and of building and low affordable financing has been really the major factors in thwarting the development of more affordable housing. And I also want to just clarify, if I may, when we speak of affordable housing, we mean housing that is meeting the need for households that make below 80% of area median income. And so that's the strata of the housing market that Burbank is in.
Oh, for this area, that would be about, for this area, that would be about
66,000.
66,000, okay.
Yeah.
And just real quickly, you were talking about how long it's taking. I realize we're in a still evolving world post-recession and loss of RDA, but what do you think is the typical time frame from conception to delivery of affordable housing project?
Well, that's a good question. We're sort of in a new environment. I could give you maybe I'll guess at a rule of thumb, pre-Great Recession would take 3 to 5 years. primarily the drivers, besides in getting entitlements, one of the main drivers is qualifying for the affordable financing. And many rounds, we often have to go back many rounds, and rounds are given every once, twice a year, and we have to go continue, and that's what drags out that timeline. In the new world, post-Great Recession, it's really hard to know how long it will take because there's so little money and so much pressure that it's hard to be very clear about when you're going to win the funds. So the timeline would certainly stretch, and I expect will stretch dramatically. And of course, that increases the risk for housing developers like us in producing that housing.
Steve?
I've been recently working on several projects in Sebastopol, mixed-use projects, live-work projects, and the goal of these projects has been to create environments that people can live and work in, so reducing traffic impact, reducing transportation, and by putting these two things together, making it a more affordable package. These have been market rate units, kind of pushing through the difficult times, but they've always been occupied, and there seems to be a desire for people to live and work in the same place and not travel a lot. So that's been my focus recently.
So I'm Hugh Futrell. My company is in Santa Rosa. I've been working in housing and mixed-use land use and commercial land use for over 35 years. My company builds entry-level, middle-income, moderate-income housing for sale, market-rate rental, as well as lower-income rental, mixed-use and commercial products, both in a suburban setting and in an urban core setting. We also do some healthcare as well. We build and also manage the assets that we create. So it's a fairly diverse perspective. I thought about what kind of project might be most applicable to the conversation, and I think that it is a component of a larger project that we are working on. This particular component is a 32-unit lower income project that will be affordable to households at 60% of median or below. That means that the households will pay for a two-bedroom apartment a little over $900 a month plus utilities. For a three-bedroom apartment, a little over $1,000 a month plus utilities. In order to make that project work, and I think this is probably where it's most applicable, there's two considerations. One, project size. 32 units is a very small lower income project from a management standpoint. It's also very small from a financing standpoint. In order even to get to 32, we received permission to take 14 units from another project, add it to 18 units here, so we had 32 units. Why? 32 units is the absolute minimum size of a project necessary to float a tax-exempt bond in order to produce the construction financing and long-term financing. Why is that important? That's important because in the state of California, if you do a tax-exempt bond, as of right, you can then obtain a 4% annual low-income tax credit, and that's really critical. The reason it's critical is that low-income projects always require a massive subsidy per unit to make them work. Where does that money come from? They either come from the public in the form of general fund dollars, they come from developers in the form of inclusionary fees or other exactions, or they come in part from the federal government. Leveraging those federal dollars for maximum affordability and the greatest number of affordable units is, in my opinion, a fundamental public policy goal because it doubles the ability to produce the number of affordable units using local resources, or it allows projects that could never be built at all to be created. So that particular project we hope will come online next year. We do other projects at larger scale, but that's one that seemed to me to be most applicable to Healdsburg.
Where is it? Yeah, where is it?
It's northwest Santa Rosa off of Fulton Road. It doesn't exist yet. It's in the planning stage, but it's connected to a larger project that we did in the same area that also includes lower income units that exist.
Okay, Bob?
Good evening, I'm Bob Comstock. I live in Dry Creek Valley. We have offices in the Bay Area and also Southern California. We're fairly active right now. We're building in some form or stage or another over 2,000 homes in the state of California, and we have 4 affordable housing projects with 4 different agencies. So I've got a real knowledge or a look at from a developer's perspective of affordable housing and how the different models work. And I'll have to say that the Sonoma Land Trust is probably the best model I've seen in my 40 years of being in the business. And we are doing also in town here the Sorrento project, which is 35 infill units right off of Healdsburg Avenue.
And Elizabeth, you want to round us out?
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Shepard, and the 3 projects I'm working on in Sonoma right now are a 46-unit subdivision in Cotati that has 4 very low-income BMRs, below market rate units, an extremely high-end single-family home in Healdsburg, and this is the construction financing for both and the equity for one of those 2 as well. And then an apartment project that will require a general plan amendment in Santa Rosa, so that's just in the planning stages.
Great. So as you can see, diverse group here representing a number of perspectives. And with the way the comments, kind of your introductions, as well as I think the pre-panel discussion we had, we were talking about kind of 2 things. We're talking about affordable housing, as you mentioned, Chuck, kind of this state-defined percentage of AMI, which is exempt from the growth management ordinance. So one of the discussions is how do we as a community build more of that? And then the other is those units that are controlled by the growth management ordinance that would include either just open market or might be priced properly and priced low enough that middle income, so I think in the community we've talked about this, basically creating housing that is priced somewhere between $450 and $650, or rents that are somewhere in around the $2,000 a month. So just to kind of frame things up with that. So I'm going to start, because Steve, you had some interesting comments on this early on, and it was, just from what we talked about earlier and this idea of this middle income housing, or let's say lower cost of ownership, cost of entry housing. What do you see if it's market driven, not highly subsidized? What are some of the tools and techniques to get there? He's thinking. We do need the Jeopardy music.
Well, I guess one of my thoughts had to do with rental housing and the question of are we looking for rental housing, or are we looking for housing that ownership housing? And it seems in order to get to a place where there's adequate housing for people that work in the community, creating rental housing may be an approach that is more in line with what's possible as opposed to ownership housing.
Okay.
And along with that, the size of the units,
Right.
Looking at smaller units, in maybe the 500 to 800 square foot range.
Hugh, you've done a lot of multifamily, and picking up on that, on just kind of the rental. If one of the paths to more housing that is affordable to middle income, not necessarily state-defined affordable housing, just housing that is more affordable, is rental. What are some of the key things about multifamily housing that kind of make it even start to work?
Well, I think there's a couple of considerations. One is it's very difficult to do a market rate rental project that isn't 40 units or more because of the rental and other efficiencies. It is very, very difficult to successfully produce a market rate rental project, even at the very high rents we now have, given what the cost factors are. So every efficiency matters. Small multifamily projects tend not to work. There's always exceptions, of course, but as a general rule, that doesn't work very well. And so you need a general plan that allows enough units to be built in a given place that allows those projects to be created. And that means certainly land that has a 15 unit per acre maximum, or potentially even more than that. There's nothing magic about 15 units. Garden apartments can be built at 20 units per acre. In some cases, even more than that. And the second consideration is a growth management ordinance that allows project of scale to be created. And make no mistake about it, without projects of scale, whether low income, which of course is exempt from your growth management ordinance, or market rate rental projects, you generally will not get them. So scale is a critical consideration in public policy.
Okay. Bob, you had some thoughts on smaller units and/or you also have apartments. You want to weigh in on this?
Well, I agree with you I'll go back on top of his comment on scale, because to give you an example, in our project we're building here currently right now in Healdsburg, our board and nail cost, not including soft costs, is coming in right around $95 to $99 a square foot. We're building the same product, we're bidding right now the same product on a 134-unit project down in Petaluma, which is closer to where the trade base is, and our board and nail cost coming in down there right now is closer to $88. So it just has, the scale with it. We're paying a premium to get the tradesmen to come up here and do the work that they need to do. My take, and I've been studying this for 6 months now, and talking to several cities on it, is that one of the ways to get to affordable housing is to get to smaller housing with higher density. And by example of that, I mean houses that are in that 600 to 800 foot range that you can build and deliver to the community in that 300,000 foot range, not even the 400 to 600. I think it really needs to be down below that. I mean, we happen to own a winery here in Dry Creek, and we have 12 employees, and I had a meeting last week, and I was sitting down, and we pay them all market wages here, and they're all making 85, in the 65 to 95,000 range. And I started going through with them, looking at our Healdsburg project to say, what would you qualify for? And it turns out that they are all in that 300 to 400,000 foot range. And so if we're going to deliver product for workers that live here, we need to come up with a product that fits that mode. And that's not just Healdsburg. That's throughout the state of California. It's epidemic, because young kids today that are in their 30-year-old kids that are now getting into the age where they want to start a family, and they're starting they want to get their first home, they're still paying off student debt. And that's a big problem out there today. So I think one of and part of that solution is the council has to get the political force to allow that type of development to happen within their community that allows that kind of housing to happen, so the person that's working at the bakery, the person that's a fireman or teacher can live within the community.
And Elizabeth, I'm going to ask you. We didn't prep this, but hopefully you can do this quick on your feet. So if I ignore what Hugh and Bob and Steve had to say, and I'm going to do a 20-unit apartment complex, 20 units here in town. Talk a little bit about the underwriting criteria by the time you think of vacancy and all of that. I mean, what does that smaller size do to the feasibility, frankly, of finding debt and equity to actually build it?
Well, the difference, I'll address it differently maybe. The difference between building a 20-unit small condominium development or townhouse development and a 20-unit apartment development is that the developer can have a much larger loan for building a for-sale project. Therefore, his equity, his cash invested in the transaction can be lower. So it's easier to build for-sale product than it is to build apartment product. Apartment product underwriting starts with the anticipated revenue, and even in a trending upward rental market, the revenue doesn't get to be trended. It's just what is the current rent per unit, and then there's a vacancy factor applied. Even if there's a zero vacancy factor, there's a mandatory minimum or average 5% vacancy. And then from that, all of the various management expenses need to be subtracted. And that's in part why he was saying that you have to have a minimum threshold of units to make the management efficient. So then you end up with a net operating income, and that's what drives the size of the financing, because the construction loan is going to be sized to the permanent loan, and the permanent loan is going to be a function of that net operating income. Is that?
Yeah,
that
that was
help?
great. Thank you. That helped. I want to jump back into a question, and Bob, you touched on this, but Hugh, because you've had some background and you said housing policy, I'm going to start with you. So how unique are the problems that we've got here in Healdsburg versus what's happening elsewhere in the state or, North Bay? I mean, how much of this is just years of policy and a great lifestyle just catching up with us in terms of pricing, and how much of it is really unique to either the way things are set up here?
Well, Healdsburg is not unique, but you are exacerbated, that's for sure. The fundamental reality throughout the North Bay and most of the Bay Area core is that employment growth and other considerations have driven up demand at a multiplier greater than new housing supply, and the result is people pay more. They pay a lot more. In some cases like Healdsburg, they pay crazily more, and that's a fundamental factor. And some of the issues that you're dealing with are the issues other communities have had to grapple with in the past to a greater degree, but continue to grapple with today. What's complicated here is your growth management ordinance. I'm an outsider. Every community should do what it thinks is best based on its own values. But as an outsider, it's clear that it's a relatively inflexible and limited tool that has probably exacerbated the supply-demand dynamic that other communities are also suffering from.
Bob, Steve, Chuck, you want to weigh in on that?
I would just echo. I mean, I think that's exactly right. It's totally right. And I think it's taken a long time to get into it, and I do think that whatever the solution is that you implement, it will take a long time to get out of. I mean, it's going to be a slow process.
Okay.
I can actually say when we financed our project here in Healdsburg, one of the biggest obstacles was getting our financial partners satisfied that we were going to get the allocations to build the units. I mean, that was one of the biggest hurdles to getting that deal closed, was the fact that you only got 15 units this year and you had to be in line to get the next 15 units. And so we were working very well with Barbara Nelson trying to understand that. And we finally got our financial partners convinced that, yes, you're going to get 15 now, and by the way, you're closing in December, and you'll be available to get 50 more in January, because you're the only person in the queue. If we had not done that, I'm not sure we could have got financing to get that project going.
Jim, I was going to say one other thing that comes to mind is that you're sort of joining with or leveraging on what Hugh had said about which I certainly echo, regarding the size of a rental project. I mean, there is economies as you increase in size up to around 58, 80 units. Our properties in Healdsburg average around 35 units, and those do just fine. But I think you have to also realize in Healdsburg, where are the opportunities for projects of that size to be built, and making more, creating more opportunities for that size of project is going to be key to meeting the need going forward.
Well, I guess one of the things, I talked about this a little earlier when we met as a panel, but it seems to me that, I haven't really built in a community that had a growth management ordinance, but I don't really understand it. I mean, it seems very one-dimensional to me. It seems like it's an attempt to try and create a more habitable community. But I don't know that it really does that. I mean, it seems like it's really, what are the concerns? Are the concerns traffic? Well, if the concerns are traffic, then maybe development that deals with minimizing traffic is what you're looking at. And maybe you have high density, but you restrict the amount of vehicles. If you want to create affordability, and it takes high density, and then there's a restriction that on the amount of vehicles people can have, or you know, you deal with the transportation. I mean, what are we trying to avoid with growth management? Is it just any kind of growth? We're looking for certain kinds of growth? Are we concerned about more traffic in our communities? If we're concerned about more traffic, maybe it isn't traffic and growth aren't necessarily one for one. Maybe there's ways to deal with them separately. So I don't know. It seems like just a blanket growth management doesn't necessarily improve the quality of life or the diversity of affordability.
Okay. Thanks for that. I'm going to remind you, if you've got questions as we're going, please fill out your cards and send them in. I think Karen's walking around, and we'll pick them up from you. So let's segue a bit, because I think that starts to create a pretty good background. I'm going to put up here some, I'm not going to read these, but some terms that you should probably know about that relate to this subject matter: affordable housing, middle income housing, deed restricted, inclusionary housing, ordinance, and allocations. So, Hugh, I think you said it. We've got, it's a challenge everywhere. It's exacerbated here in Healdsburg. Walter Kieser, with Economic Planning Systems, that did the market needs assessment in the fall, said you basically have a market failure here. As in a classic economist term, you have a market failure. And so the question is, how do you fix that failure? Do we do more regulation to try and either mitigate that failure, or do we try to remove regulation? And so one of the things that the committee has been discussing, if we say we've got this gap of affordable housing, we've got a limitation on how much new housing can get built by the private sector, should we be increasing the so-called inclusionary housing ordinance? The inclusionary housing ordinance, as it stands in Healdsburg, if somebody builds a project of market rate housing, every 7th house has to fill some kind of an affordable housing requirement. And it's a lot more complex than that, but just figure 15% of what gets built. So in Bob's project, Bob, how many deed-restricted affordable units do you have in your project?
We have 6.
6, and that's actually over and above the 15%,
Yeah.
if I remember correctly, right? And Bob's partnered with Dev, where's Dev? To figure out how to do that in a way that's actually made those not just rentals, but they're actually purchased by the homeowners. Okay, so that seems like a win-win. Developer gets to build their homes, community gets some protected, affordable housing that's in perpetuity, so that seems like, and that's a tool that's been around a long time, and all the time I've been doing this, 15 to 17% has been kind of the magic number. And it's driven by a lot of things. But it seems like as things have gotten worse and prices have gotten higher, people are starting to suggest maybe there's developments in San Francisco now that are pushing 40%. I've worked in Santa Fe where they tried 30%. So I wanted to talk to the panel a little bit about inclusionary housing ordinances in general as a way to at least regulate to a better outcome than just trying to solve it with the open market. And then secondly, at what point, where's our planning director, Barbara Nelson? Barbara has a great phrase that 20% of nothing is nothing. So, or 50% of nothing is nothing. So at what point do we have, Bob, you were able to make it work at 15 and above, but at what point does it not start to work? Or what would be the implications in your mind as you push that percentage up? Anyone want to talk? You want to take that one first?
Well, when I was asked this question the other day, and I had a chance to think about it, what it's going to do when you start pushing, even when you include the 15, and the market is kind of adjusted to that, land sellers have adjusted that that's what it's going to be. But if you start pushing it up from there...
Bob, explain that concept a second. That's really important. The land sellers have adjusted to that. So what does that mean?
Well, it means that they know that when their broker or their agent comes up to them and says, we're going to sell your land for $2 million, he's already factored into the fact that he's going to have to put 15% to affordable, because the developer is going to put that in his pro forma. Or we put it in ours anyway. And that's why we're still in business. But if you start ratcheting that up above 15, what you're really doing is you're ratcheting down land value, unless you change that with increased density. If there's not a combination of the two, it's pushing on one end or the other.
Is there a possibility that you just increase the gap? Meaning that those homes that are now paying market rate, instead of being $800,000, are now $1 million to pay for the 20 or 30%, or it just doesn't work even at that rate?
I think it's all market driven at that point.
Yeah.
I mean, I know Deb we're working with Deb right now in Healdsburg here, and I think we've had 4 sales now, and and which I was really proud of. One of them is a local policeman that's fitting into into the program, and he's buying that home that we're selling for, I think, $700,000. He's been able to buy it for $350,000.
Well, the city can require, in a way, whatever it wants, but the fundamental fact is you know, what are the numbers? And there's a broader policy question. Do you have an inclusionary ordinance that requires units to be built on site, or do you allow fees to be paid? The reality is, and it's simply indisputable, really, that you will get more affordability, you'll get more affordable units, you'll get greater affordability in terms of the AMIs on a rental basis if you exact fees from market rate developers as opposed to forcing them to incorporate units in their project. And that's because the fees can be used to leverage with federal tax credits to double or even more than double the number of affordable units at greater affordability. That's simply a fact. Now, there are other social reasons why you may not want to do that, such as spreading the units all around, incorporating them in a sort of seamless way into existing neighborhoods. But make no mistake about it, the offset for that decision is fewer affordable units elsewhere in the community, which means fewer people in Healdsburg who are served by those units. Now, in terms of the impact on pro formas, the fact of the matter is that it costs something like a unit that's at 60% of median income has a borrowing capacity of something like $80,000, and it has a total product cost under the best case between $200,000 and $250,000. That's not a price to a third party; it's what it costs the developer. That means there's something like a minimum of $170,000 of subsidy that has to go into that unit in order to create it. Where that comes from is the critical question. If it comes from the developer, that means that there is inherently a need to maximize profit elsewhere in their product types, to edge out lower value units, which means edging out moderate income units, and get to the greatest possible values in what remains so that you have enough income stream for all that other money that's needed. So I would say that if you're going to increase inclusionary requirements, you've got to exempt projects that are moderate income directed, you've got to exempt second units from the calculations as well. You've got to exempt market rate rental units from that exaction, or else you're not going to get those product types at those increased levels of inclusionary exaction. And I would note one other thing too. If you do a rental project, you cannot require under state law, you may have already had conversations on this topic, you can't require inclusionary units to be incorporated within that project at restricted rents. That's not allowed. You can charge fees, but you can't force feed the units into the project.
Chuck, I saw you pick up the mic a couple times. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to, I totally agree with what Hugh said, very well stated regarding how much more efficient it is to use fees rather than inclusionary units. And I do agree again that it's a social good to have inclusionary units built, but it does come at a cost to the community for sure. And the most efficient way to use the dollars is through an in lieu fee, and that fee then can be aggregated again to build more efficient housing, affordable housing.
Have you done any projects? So if two kind of sounds like disconnected goals. One is to create affordable housing as integratively as possible in the community, and the other is to use the limited resources as efficiently as possible. Have you or others ever partnered with an affordable housing builder to do those units within another project, or within let's say, a market project?
Well, to some degree, yes. We've received a land donation from developers to build an affordable project as a part of their project, or on a parcel adjacent to their project, we've done that as well. Yeah.
And Saggio Hills, yeah, it's kind of like that. Although we haven't built anything, and I guess that would be the next thing, because if I remember correctly, a place like San Francisco, which is a whole different scale, collected a lot of fees, but has built very little affordable housing as a result of it. It's really all of the stuff that's in the Bay Area has been delivered by the market itself. I think Spur did a big report on that. So So it's more efficient to collect the fees, but is there the capacity, or what does it take to get the capacity to actually build it then?
What do you mean by that? I'm sorry,
Well,
I don't
how does
follow.
it actually get built in that case?
In the case of fees?
In fees, yes.
Well, you know, the fees are collected by developers as they develop, by the municipality, and the municipality puts it into a pot, and then it's allocated based on an award to projects that are deemed to be, you know, most efficient and worthy, based on a myriad of criteria, of course. But that's the basic process of it.
We have a couple of questions from the audience, so I think we've covered the inclusionary housing ordinance one. Where's Mike? Did we get that answered for you? Okay.
No, that didn't answer for me.
Pardon me?
That did not answer it.
Okay.
My question was,
Oh, no, I haven't gotten to, Mike had asked a specific question about inclusionary housing ordinance.
which is what my question was, so maybe you were just talking with a different.
Yeah, okay, I'll look yours up here. So let's see. So the next question was, how do we find strategies to drive down the cost of land to allow for less expensive alternative types of homes to be built? I mean, we talked about it being about the land cost, or maybe start there. How much of Healdsburg's challenge is, I mean, Bob, you talked about just the trades premium that we pay here because it's a small market, but what is the impact of land cost on affordability, and what are the ways to actually drive that down?
Well, I think the most logical way to drive that down goes back to the higher density issue. Because if you try to, well, two examples. We just were approached a couple of weeks ago to look at two broken projects from 2007 in a neighboring community. And we went out and spent 2 weeks looking at it and underwriting it. And these were traditional 8,000 square foot lots. And the market, where it is today from where it needs to be, we actually had a negative land value when you did your underwrite, meaning that the landowner would have had to pay us to take the land from him if we were going to build those projects. And so without having changed the density there, or they're going to sit there until the market appreciates back to a much higher price, those projects aren't going to get built.
Steve? Land costs. Come on, you're doing small projects. You must be challenged.
One of the questions I have when you made that comment previously, because I heard the same thing on a piece of property we had in Cotati from a potential buyer, that there was a negative value to the land, but the biggest part of that had to do with the city impact fees related to that land. So, it's not just the value of the land; it's the value. A very big, in this particular case, was a very, very high traffic impact fee, a fee that the city had just raised. And when the city was told that was that the properties couldn't get developed because of the size of that fee, they decided to look at those fees again. So I think impact fees are a way that has a big effect on the value of the land and what can be built.
I agree totally with that. I mean, that's all part of the puzzle. But it's easier to look at the landowner than it is to go to a city and say, waive your fees. I mean, we ran into that several years ago on a project in Southern California, in Signal Hill, and the city wanted development to take place, and they had a park fee at that time of $50,000 a door, and which has made everything unfinanceable. And so we went back, 'cause fortunately for us, it was redevelopment back then. We went back to the city and negotiated with the city, so the city waived that fee if we put in a hiking trail that circled Signal Hill to allow the Sierra Club and all the surrounding residents to use it, which was much less than the $50,000 a door, and we ended up developing over 400 units on Signal Hill for them. But you're absolutely right, it's all part of the formula.
Okay, here's another good one. Since market rate housing is alive and thriving, and those below median income are really the ones that need to be housed, why does the GMO need to be changed? Really, is the only way to get to affordable housing by putting the squeeze on sugar daddy developers and trickle down housing? More voodoo. So I think, and I would say throughout the conversations we've had over the last 18 months, I think there has been for me, there's been an underlying theme of how much of solving the affordable housing challenge that we have here can be accomplished by properly directing the private market versus subsidizing a lot more robustly the public market. So, Steve, you got a mic? Go.
Well, I think one of the things that in answer to that is, you know, the nature of the affordable market is tied in some cases to deed restrictions, and it's not an attractive thing for developers to deal with. And, you know, when you're looking at smaller houses, when you're looking at smaller footprints, more density as a way to solve the affordability problem, and there's a formula there that then works for developers and works for affordability, then you've got a formula that's, I think, easier to deal with than affordability, than the whole financing part of low-income housing.
I think I just kind of echo what you said earlier, that, you know, you're not going to be able to reach the depth of affordability that for instance, Burbank reaches below 60% or 80% of area median income without some governmental funding coming into it, and a significant amount. I mean, you know, we are looking at anywhere between, say, 125 to 150,000 per unit of local financing in our rental projects to make them pencil. And you know, again, that's extremely important dollars, because those dollars can be leveraged to win federal tax credits, and you know, essentially those credits will pay for half or more of the project cost. So those are very powerful dollars, but you can't reach the affordability we're looking at without that government, local government contribution.
And so just to be devil's advocate, so I think the question is saying, so what's that got to do with the GMO? I mean, it's like, okay, so we've just got to find money to build, because the market, what you're saying is the private market will not be able to build that product. And so what is the private market's role? If our only goal is to build that kind of housing, what role would the private market be playing in that?
Well, you know, back to the inclusionary concept versus in lieu fee, the more market rate development you have, the more fees you would be able to collect, the more money you would have in a pot that could be used to pay that $125,000 to $150,000 of local investment per unit. And so that's a way to power the investment in the subsidized housing.
Okay.
Well,
Go ahead, Steve.
I was going to say another thing is, I guess that, you know, is affordable housing, you know, subsidized affordable housing really the only problem that this community is dealing with? Or, you know, when you talk about the policemen, when you talk about the firemen, they're not necessarily affordable housing people. They're medium income people, and they might be the ones that don't fit into any category. So I think that's an issue that needs to be taken up by the for-profit developer in a creative way in combination with the community and the city.
Yeah, one thing I do want to highlight, you know, our financing really is only applicable up to 60%. Tax credits only up to 60%, some other financing up to 80%. But then it falls off. There isn't subsidy. So for that, anything above that, so you do have to be sure that you're capturing the 80 to 120 market, area median income market, part of the market, because that's obviously the real middle. And I know that the discussion is between the 120 to 160% of AMI, but that 80 to 120 is an important segment where we don't have subsidy to build that kind of affordable housing.
I would like to comment on this as well. I think it's important to look concretely at the different components of the community. Traditionally, less than 80% of median income, lower income households, were traditionally served in Class B, Class C apartment complexes, and increasingly over the last generation also through subsidized housing. There's no way for this community to serve that group except through subsidized housing. You can't do it. So understanding how inclusionary zoning ordinance works to produce the resources to match up with federal dollars to allow companies like Burbank or others to produce those units is fundamental for serving those people, because the vast majority of people in your city who are between 0 and 80% median are not in subsidized housing today. And they are the ones who are the most struggling in your community as well as every other one. Then you've got 80 to 120%, which is the traditional area of entry level for sale housing, where people ultimately transition out of Class B, Class A apartment complexes into entry-level housing. Your price structure means that will never come back to Healdsburg again. But where they can be served is through market rate rental housing, which many of them will be able to afford. So finding a way to structure your policies to serve that group is also fundamental. You're then dealing with the group over 120% of median, which traditionally would have no trouble buying a home. Doesn't work here anymore. I believe, I haven't seen the numbers, you've probably got to get to 150, 160% in median before you hit that affordability. So tailoring a product type with more density, smaller units, potentially some infrastructure savings to serve that working group in your community is also fundamental. To understand housing affordability, it's really important to bear in mind the different components that policy has to serve and the range of incomes that deal with very different problems.
So Hugh, that's a great segue, and I want to pick up on that because I think you articulated the things that we've talked about and challenged, which is that 120, and you hit it right on, 160 is kind of the area that Walter Kieser again said, that's the area where people are making too much to qualify for affordable, not enough to get financed for market. So the discussion we had earlier, so that we have been working a lot of the policies that are in the proposals within the changes to the GMO are to incentivize, to allocate, to somehow drive the market to build those at that price point, but also deed restrict them so that they stay that way in that class forever. And I know the group had some thoughts about deed restrictions on that, so I want to pick up where. So let's say we figure out a way that the market builds it. The question is, do we deed restrict it going forward?
Well, let's be clear if we're talking about rental or for sale. So a deed restriction.
Take them one at a time.
Right. So a deed restricted product for rental normally means it's a low-income subsidized project in which you're restricting the rents for 30 or even 55 years, depending on the program. And that's not uncommon. That works. There's a zillion models for it, and Healdsburg itself is already doing that, I'm sure. When you get to for sale, though, deed restrictions are very, very complex and difficult for a lot of different reasons. Let's say, for example, that a policeman, policewoman, can purchase a unit in Healdsburg for $500,000 with a deed restriction that limits their appreciation on that unit for the lifetime of that unit. Or they can drive up the road to Cloverdale and pay $500,000 for a very similar unit with no deed restriction. Or they can drive south to Windsor and pay $500,000 for that unit, also with no deed restriction. Why will they stay in this community? They've got to really like Healdsburg an awful lot to do that. And there's going to be some that may wish to for a lot of different reasons. But in general, when you cap appreciation, you're attacking directly one of the motivations for home buyers. And that's especially true as we move into this era in which people are a little more oriented towards being willing to rent rather than own. People who are now buying are just as oriented as ever towards the potentials for appreciation. That creates a real problem, potentially, of marketing those units. And as someone who would come, let's say, in theory, to the community to build those units, I would say, why do I want to take that risk of trying to sell those units with a deed restriction? I wouldn't really want to do that. There are certain kinds of restrictions that can be accepted, like periods of 90 days in which you need to sell those units to members of the community, and then those controls are off. And there may be some others as well. But in general, deed restrictions are problematic, and not only for the reason I mentioned, also they are a catch basin for litigation historically throughout the state, because people, when they discover the unit, if it were on the market, is worth $700,000, and they've got to sell it because of that deed restriction for $400,000, they begin to look for every way possible to break that contract. There's also a managerial issue for deed restrictions. Management requires, in many cases, title companies to pick up those restrictions successfully. There is a long history in the state of California of title companies missing those restrictions and units being lost to that restricted pool because of that. And if you're not going to rely entirely on title companies, then you have to rely on municipal management to do it, and there's a significant cost that falls onto the community because of that.
Bob, you want to talk a little bit about your, is it Spanish, not Spanish Islands, what was the project you were talking about today where it's similar to what Hugh was just talking about, but at least as a concept of how they made it available to,
Oh, that was a project we did down in Santa Fe Springs.
Santa Fe Springs.
And it was a redevelopment project at the time, and I think we did about 350 units there, and the city came in and helped subsidize the oil cleanup because it was a 55-acre oil field that was being redeveloped. But part of the restriction, or not restriction, but in the city of Santa Fe Springs, 90% of Santa Fe Springs is industrial park and office space, and they have very little housing stock, but a lot of employees that work in Santa Fe Springs. So we agreed with the city at that time that the first 90 days, we would offer up the housing to people that worked within Santa Fe Springs. And so we sent out a notice to every company there that when we were releasing a phase, that the 90-day clock is starting, and we ended up selling probably about 50% of those units in that project went to people that lived in Santa Fe Springs that were commuting before that.
There's a couple of themes, a couple of similar questions here that are related, and so they go like, one is, if you were the housing czar, what would you change? I think we talked about there are certain things that are baked into building code and state fire regulations that we're kind of locked into, but what are the things that could be done at the local level that would increase maybe the speed, the ease of financing, and ultimately then the ability to build lower cost housing within the community? And I know we've maybe touched on some of these, but repeat them if they're the same things. So, Steve, I'm going to put it over to you.
Increased density and lower fees.
So let's talk about the fees, because it's a somewhat of a double-edged sword. I think everybody that lives here just got your notice that your water rates or your sewer rates are going to go up because, as somebody said, we're an enterprise community. So how do you balance reducing the fees, the connection fees, the connection fees or whatever, and all the other things, the park fees, the traffic fees, and all of that, and at the same time continue to maintain some of the integrity of the community's finances? Is it because right now everything costs kind of the same, so with the exception of maybe the school fees? So are you working places where they actually change? It's a sliding scale for some of those things?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think there's a relationship between smaller units, less infrastructure, lower fees, which isn't really recognized in the fee structure of most communities now.
Bob, you're building here. You're actually building here. You've been through it. What would you change?
The only thing I thought of when I went, because I actually looked at our fee schedule yesterday to see could we really look at realistically and say, what could the city do that's not providing essential services like police, fire, and all the things we want. And there are only two. One was your building fee, and the other was your park fees. And I would only make those applicable, to be quite honest, to the affordable housing side of that, not to the market rate. Because then you could then help the affordable housing side by not laboring them with the same fees as a market rate house you're having to pay for.
It's a complicated subject, reducing fees successfully, because you do have needs. I do hope Healdsburg will scrutinize their fee schedule with care. Smaller units with fewer bedrooms do put, as a general rule, there are some exceptions, less demand on public services. Police folks will tell you that higher density per unit does produce more police calls, however. So you got to be careful about that. But in terms of parks, infrastructure, sewer, and water, I mean, there's just no doubt. And so you need a fairly sophisticated fee ordinance that's accurate. To get purely into the business of waiving fees, or deferring fees, which is actually, if it's a lower income project, is the better way to do it for various reasons, is a complex subject, to be sure, and probably not the main vehicle to be used to create greater affordability in the community, because it would be very much just on the margins, I think. I'm sorry, I want to add, that's not to say that fees are not astronomically high. They are, and it's not to say they don't have an immense impact on inhibiting affordable housing, because they do.
Or the affordability of housing as opposed to affordable housing, although it's both. Yeah. And just, as you know, I think Healdsburg, based on analysis that was done in a prior report, Healdsburg kind of sits in the middle of the North Bay. So their fees, it's not like our fees here are 2 times everybody else. They're actually kind of in the middle. There are jurisdictions that have higher fees, so they're actually managing things pretty well. Here's a good one. So somebody mentioned earlier, we have Saggio Hills, which you may know, big high-end luxury project that was approved on the north end of town. The exaction or the inclusionary kind of outcome of that was 14 acres of land that the developer provided with certain improvements for the city then to move forward and build affordable housing. I think it's up to 150 acres, or 150 units, excuse me. So the question is, how would these be funded? Is $170,000 per unit subsidy required? Did Hugh really say this? So Chuck, Hugh, Steve, Bob, those of you that are working in affordable housing, what is the subsidy that's really required?
Well, the local subsidy we find is well over 100,000 per unit when you reach a project size around 50 to 70 units. Yeah,
And
it
if it's
definitely
smaller, it goes up?
Yes, per unit.
Per unit.
The aggregate amount may be lower.
Right,
But the
right.
per unit amount will be higher.
Okay.
And you know, unfortunately, that's used to be helped, it used to be kept a little lower by the availability of other sources at the state level. But those pots are generally depleted unless you're in a transit zone, you know, like alongside SMART, for instance, where you can win, and you have parameters that allow your project to win the cap and trade funds that go to the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities, you know, pot. If you can win those funds, then of course that'll help the local amount that's needed. But those sites will be very limited, and therefore, you know, with the absence there's also a veterans pot of money to serve specific population of veterans. But aside from those, the state level funding is fairly depleted, and therefore it means there's more of a burden upon the local municipalities.
So what are the locals doing with the places where you're working with? This is maybe not easy, but at least has been accomplished. Where are those funds coming from?
Well, to some degree, around the Bay Area, there's an interest, and in some cases there have been passage of bond measures to raise funds for housing. But otherwise, I think most municipalities are trying to take advantage of the increase in economic activity in the private sector through inclusionary, you know, provisions and in lieu fees to use those fees that accumulate to support affordable housing. And to some degree, there's also a movement to use the money that the state does provide back to municipalities in place of redevelopment, which is often referred to as the boomerang funds. And there's you know, in many communities, an interest in dedicating a portion of those funds to housing, to somewhat replace what used to be provided by redevelopment. So those are a few ideas that are in play, but they are, you know, nowhere near making up the amount that has been provided in the past.
Chuck, just for clarity, your $100,000 subsidy is after receiving federal tax credits for a project.
Yes, that's right. Yeah,
That's right.
that's the gap that's what it takes to fill the gap, and it takes, if you want to win 9%, it can take a greater number.
And is that assuming the land is free, as in the case of Saggio Hills, or is that assuming that you have to buy land?
That would assume you're buying the land.
buying the land. So
Yeah.
if we have free land, can you?
That'll
count-
help.
That helps. And can you count that as the community's contribution?
If the land is contributed by the municipality,
Okay,
yeah.
okay, good. Did you just have a question, or did you have a comment
Well,
on that,
just-
Steve? Hugh?
When you, taking tax credits off the table, you end up with that number between 150 and 200,000. But that just points out the critical importance of tax credits to reduce that gap down.
Right, and Chuck, you said something earlier that it's typically, you never get them on the first shot. You're typically going back a couple of times to get the tax credits.
Well, there are two types of tax credits. The most powerful, those that bring you the most equity for the project, are the 9% tax credits. Those are extremely competitive. And yeah, you'd have to have a real home run project to win that on the first round. But you could, depends on how your project scores. The 4% are not as powerful. They don't bring in as much equity, and therefore you need more local subsidy to make them work. But they are not competitive. So if you do have that local subsidy and other sources, then you can simply apply and get those 4% tax credits.
Okay, I want to move over to, I want to get back to this project size issue, because that is, I think, it's a big concern. I mean, the community, first of all, we've done a little bit of an analysis, I don't know how many people know this, analysis of the community of what's available in terms of future development sites. And Healdsburg is approaching build out in, say, 20, 30 years kind of thing. So the available sites, if you take them and you kind of use the density that we have, would yield somewhere around projects that are typically 11 to 20 units. So the ability to build there are a few sites where an 80-unit project or 40-unit project, but most of the stuff that we're going to see or can be done here is going to come in project sizes of 10 to 20 units. So I'm just curious, one of the questions, Chuck, was, well, if we can't do an 80-unit project, could you do 4 20s and, kind of have the roving management crew? Or Hugh, the same thing, if you're doing market rate. What are the implications of smaller projects still giving you control of the same number of units, but what's it cost the same to build? Does it cost the same to manage, or how does that work? Elizabeth's shaking her head. Can you finance it?
It's not that
Mike?
Oh, sorry. It's not that it can't be financed, but it's not efficient. I mean, it's not cost-effective to be building in 4 different sites with 4 different terrains, with 4 different, it isn't, they'll speak to it better, but I'm shaking my head because it's not efficient.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I can only speak from my own experience, which is the projects I've done have been infill sites and 12 units, 5 units. So, I guess one of the questions is, are they rentals? Are they for sale? I'm not sure they can't be done, but I don't have the experience that some of the other people here have. But it seems to me that, when you're dealing with infill sites, you have to find a way to make it work. And part of that is through the design, and a big part of that is through the management. And I know there's a lot of management companies that manage multiple projects. So, but I can't personally say the total viability, but it seems like we have to find a way to make those infill sites viable.
Hugh, you were kind of shaking your head on that question. What are your thoughts?
Well, for multifamily rental, you really do need to get to 40 units for any kind of economies of scale on the management side, because I would stress again, it's just very, very difficult to produce these projects at all and make them work financially. A 40-unit project in many communities would be considered an infill project. I mean, but I do certainly agree. There are many examples of 5, 10, 12-unit projects that are very lovely and work successfully, but they are almost invariably for sale projects, and that can work just fine, I think. But it's a particular kind of developer who's going to do a 5 or 10 unit project, and many aren't able to do that, but some would. So I think it's important to say that you can't be entirely dogmatic about all this, but it's important to recognize that size really does matter when it comes to affordability, whether you're talking about for sale or rental.
And talk for a second, because we haven't talked about this, but I know, I see it in all the work I do in California, the defect liability, the impacts of the defect liability laws in California on for sale, smaller infill, non-single-family detached homes. And Steve, you're doing that. Do you worry about that? Does it come back, has it been a problem for you to either insure, or does it come back to be just a latent risk that you have to deal with later on? Or have
Well,
you not had anything built for 10 years, so it doesn't matter?
We did have to deal with that, and you know, a lot of that comes with the homeowners association.
Right.
And, you know, we developed a form which was an owners association that actually excluded the actual buildings from the formula and took into consideration the grounds and other parts which were part of the association, and the units weren't. So we tried to work with that, and there's several other developers, there's at least one other developer in Santa Rosa I know that's used that same vehicle to lower the risk on a smaller project. But, you know, I think that's one of the big factors, for sure.
Bob, have you had any experience with that or seen the impacts of that?
Well, we switched years ago to wrap insurance so that we insure all of our subcontractors, and so that we have a policy that overrides everything else. And as far as latent defects, I mean, there's a group of attorneys, I can't think of the law firm right now, but I know they're out of San Diego, and they wait till your 9th year and then go out, start sending flyers to your homeowners association saying, guess what, we can get you money to fix your screens even though you didn't take care of them. And we've seen that come through 2 or 3 projects in the last 10 years, but we've been pretty insistent in fighting those suits. And I can say it costs us dollars, but we've been able to prevail on all of them. But it is a cost of the business.
Cost of business in California. Okay, I'm going to move forward here because there were some questions here about costs and that. And so following on this theme of smaller projects, what's available going forward in the community, we put together this little hypothetical example of a project opportunity. This is not a project per se, but it's a project opportunity. Gave it to the panelists to kind of look at and opine on. They didn't do, you know, a whole full pro forma on it, although I think Elizabeth did some great work on it. But this is pretty typical of what some of the opportunity sites are in Healdsburg going forward. About 1.5 acres. The price and stuff that just recently closed in this range, $2.5 million. So you can see that the zoning at the upper end is typically 16 units per acre. So to a number of the comments we heard tonight, is that enough density to really justify that? I mean, you can do the math real quickly. That's 1.5 acres at 16 units per acre. That's 24 units at $2.5 million. You've got $100,000 just in the land cost to begin with before you do anything else. Parking requirements in the city are 1.5 spaces, one of which must be covered. We've got the inclusionary housing ordinance, which you talked about, which is 15%. So if you built those 24 units, 15% of them would have to be affordable, and based on what we talk about, that would be a subsidy. And the city fees run on average, kind of gross round numbers, about $45,000 per unit. So for the assumptions I gave them, assume there's no environmental issues, we don't have any toxics, the utilities are already there, we wouldn't have to go through a long, painful CEQA process, we'd get a neg deck or maybe even an exemption, but it would require a planning commission review and taking that through the major design review. So panelists, you've all had a chance to look at this, and do you have any immediate kind of thoughts on this, or what did it spark in your mind about, if you saw this opportunity, would you do this? What would it take? Do the numbers in rough sense make sense? Bob, you're building here. You want to go first?
Well, when I looked at your model, first time I saw it was early this evening. It's something that our firm would not go after. It's very difficult to pay the superintendents that we're paying because we hire some top guys, and to spread that cost over 16 units it doesn't pencil. Unless those 16 units we're selling for, you know, if they're $1 million or plus homes, then you can kind of spread the cost across that. But if you're spreading, trying to spend the superintendent and all your overhead of your company across 16 units, our firm, we wouldn't be competitive there.
Steve, you do smaller stuff. Would that be attractive to you, or what stands out as maybe, gee, maybe this could work if it did this, or I could get that?
Well, I guess the question is...
Use your mic.
I guess the question is if that's not feasible, then the land isn't worth 2.5 million. So, I mean, the feasibility, the construction cost isn't flexible, and what you have to pay the supervisor isn't flexible. What's flexible is what the land's worth, and to some degree what the city fees are, but really the value of the land is powered by what can be done there, and if, and I guess that also reflects on the fact that, if you're going to build 16 units on an acre, can they sell for $1 million? And probably they can't.
Right.
So then then the land's worth less.
So Bob, if that density was doubled though, and you had 32, well, you'd actually have 24, so now you'd have 48 units, would that be more attractive and/or get us to something that maybe is not deed restricted, but is more affordable to the middle income?
I guess the rule of thumb that we work by is that we look at projects and look what the gross revenue is going to come off of that project to spread all of our overhead costs. Meaning not only we have the superintendent out there, but then we have our costs that we got to, for our accountants and everybody else inside our office. And so it really gets down to kind of a matrix. If we're building $500,000 homes, then we want to be in that 50 unit and above range to spread all of our costs across that to make it efficient. If we're in a $2 million range, then we'd probably go as small as 20 units. But so it's kind of a sliding scale that we look at for profitability.
What about you?
Well, the numbers prevent any rental project of any kind from being built. So you start with that
The
fact.
number of units or the cost of the land?
No, the cost per unit.
Per
in
unit,
that
100,000 per
scenario.
door.
So
Okay.
it's just it's impossible. So now you've got a for sale project at 25 units at 25 units in acres. That means it's a 3-story building with tuck-under parking, expensive to build. You fill it up. You have little opportunity for open space in that design. You're not going to get the pricing you need as a condominium to justify it. So as a condominium project, doesn't work. The product type is too risky. Numbers won't work. So the next thing you look at is, okay, let's go down to 6 units per acre. Now let's look at 9 units. And let's begin, depending on the neighborhood, you've just created a scenario there in which creating a 9-unit project with a single lower income or affordable duplex incorporated somehow seamlessly into the design is the only thing that can be done at a price far above anything that you're trying to accomplish through your exercise tonight.
So here's a great follow-on question. So what would the land have to be priced at to do what we want?
For rental, it needs to be down to $25,000 to $30,000 a door for it to successfully work, and the other numbers really would require a closer analysis. I would say though that there is not a clean relationship between costs and land value. Econ 1A, it says it ought to be that way, but people withdraw stuff from the market. They get a little overexcited about how much money they're going to make. The pro formas we look at, easily 9 out of 10 properties that are being offered when we do a regression analysis, the property is overvalued and there is no persuading anybody that they should lower their price down low enough to make it work. So it sits out in the market, basically.
And Elizabeth, you kind of ran some numbers on this. So if I were to come in and I said, I've got this deal and I've got, I'm going to do 24 units as my price. I mean, what kind of things would you be asking me about the feasibility of this project? I mean, you had looked at these numbers earlier and kind of did that little spreadsheet, but I guess the question is, as a lender, what are you looking at when somebody comes in? First of all, you said there isn't. First of all, would you loan me the money to buy it?
Well, it depends.
Like?
Depends on your development plan. The money is a function of what pencils. So if the developers are telling you that this doesn't pencil, then there's not a lot I have to say about being able to finance it.
But the community loves it, and we're going to sell it and all that. Wasn't that enough to carry the day?
Not really.
Not really. How about crowdfunding? The crowdfunding? Okay, we're gonna wrap up here. It's getting close to 8:15, or it's getting close to 8, and it wouldn't be too bad if we ended a little bit early. So we're gonna do a quick lightning round, and I'm just gonna ask. I'm gonna make a few remarks. I'm gonna ask the panel a question, so you guys have a few minutes to think about it, and then I'm gonna do a few closing remarks, and then we'll come back and let you do the closeout. So the lightning round is just basically based on everything that we've heard in the last, and you've been a part of in the last 3 hours now. What would be a key take-home point, piece of advice, recommendation that you might make to the community to achieve? You saw the targets that we had out there. What were some of the things that you think we should work harder on, need to think harder about, or look to doing in the future? Just in a quick little snippet. So while you're thinking about that, couple of things. Remind you of the exit surveys. Timeline, we will be going through the housing action plan process over the next 60 days. There will be further open houses, not more presentations, but open houses for you to come in, meet with us, and talk about what are some of the evolving objectives and things that you saw, and then some of the actions that are being recommended. This will go to the council, the housing action plan, which really informs a lot about what's going on with the allocations. That will go to council in the summer for adoption. So that will really drive and set the cycle for what we want to do in housing starting in 2017. Those of you that did not get your questions answered, if you remember the process last year, we took each one of these back, we wrote them up, we wrote an answer to them, and published them on the website. So there will be answers given to each of these to the extent that we can either read your writing or answer your question. But I think last year we did all of them, so we won't let them go away. With that, we're going to go through the panel, and then before you all leave, I want to make sure that we thank the panel because everybody donated their time. I think you guys have provided some great insight, great cross-section, and really valuable at this point in our journey to try and figure this thing out. So Chuck, I'm going to start with you. The lightning round, quick word of final closing piece of advice, observation, or recommendation.
Okay, well, I think it has been mentioned many times, but that's probably why we're mentioning it in the closing round. To increase densities, I mean, that's key. And encourage smaller units is another important thing. I would also add, increase land zoned, for housing in the town where that's possible. And lastly, or actually second to last, I would say it is, from an affordable housing developer's perspective, in other words, under 60 to 80% of AMI, it's just really, really key for the town to prioritize its funding for affordable housing because it has such an enormously powerful leveraging effect when it's used with tax credits and to win tax credits. So that's another thing I'd stress. The last thing is I really think that from this it would be useful to have some sort of work group to pick up. I think the input of the developers in the community and all in the panel here is just could be very valuable to the town, and I'd certainly be happy to participate however that is needed in the future, but to carry on the discussion.
Great. Thank you for that. Steve, go right down the line.
Well, it seems to me after listening and thinking that really the housing needs that people want to see satisfied here in terms of low and medium is really going to be satisfied in the rental market and not in the for sale market. And some of it's going to be infill, and the issue is how you manage that infill. And so I think those are the questions. I don't know what the answers are, but it seems like that's the focus, and that's where I would be thinking those things.
Several quick items. Change growth management so you can get scale. Allow projects to pay their in lieu fees so they can be leveraged up with tax credits so you can maximize the number of low-income units that get produced at the best possible affordability. And third, increase densities allowable for market rate units so that you can begin to get a product type that serves that 120 to 160% category.
I pretty much ditto Hugh's comments. I think I can't add anything to that. I think my focus right now going forward, in not only in Healdsburg but in other communities, is to be able to bring in that product, that we can deliver product that is affordable to the new buyer that's in the 30 to 35 age range to buy their first home. Because right now, what I'm seeing throughout the state of California, it's just not available.
And fortunately, nobody said deed restricting, so I can say that one. I think I would encourage you to look carefully at a 99-year deed restriction. There's some good ideas about that have even been implemented where home buyers who live in the town can be given first priority for a period of time, but I would really encourage you to revisit that.
Well, thank you very much. If I can have everybody join me in giving the panel a round of applause. And a big thank you again for all your work, and a big thank you to all of you that came out and those of you that have been coming regularly to be a part of this conversation. The next Community Housing Committee meeting is Monday, April the 11th, and we will be talking further about this and probably discussing what we learned tonight. So thanks again for coming.